Good afternoon. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Mike Franc, and I'm the director here at the Washington, D.C. office for the Hoover Institution. Welcome. What we're going to do today is have a discussion led by Lee Edwards, our honored guest today, of his latest book, which is an autobiography. And one parochial Hoover Institution point I'll make at the outset is that Lee's papers, all his official papers, are at the Hoover Library and Archives at Stanford University in Palo Alto. And Lee availed himself of that, obviously, when he was writing the book. And in his acknowledgments makes the point that there were some things you discovered in your own papers that you either thought were lost or maybe you had forgotten about. Right. So maybe I could suggest that as you talk about the book and your life, what's it like to go through all your archival papers and find things that you'd completely forgotten about? It would scare me.
I can't believe I said that.
It would scare me very much so.
Bad and good.
I just think that's a fascinating...
Was I really that stupid when I said that?
Exactly, right. So anyway, so Lee Edwards, for those of you who do not know Lee, is really sort of one of the great historians of the conservative movement. He's written over 25 books. He has a great biography of Barry Goldwater. He's written a history of modern conservatism from different angles. He's written history of the Heritage Foundation, where he's the distinguished fellow in conservative thought there, where I've gotten to know Lee over the years and I've come to admire him so much. One passion of Lee's that everyone should know about is going to come to full fruition next week. Lee founded and is I guess, the board chairman of the Victims of Communism Fund, which ended up getting a memorial here in Washington, dedicated by President George W. Bush. And it's Lee's passion, and as you read through this, you'll see that on the different pillars of conservatism and anti-communism, preservation of liberty, that broad set of concerns is his real, true passion. And if you look in the jacket, you'll see he's received awards from a number of the captive nations over the years who have appreciated what he's done. And anyone who, next week, it's 7th, 8th, and 9th of November. It's a major program, Library of Congress and Union Station, to look at and examine the 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's one of those things where I think if we could all aspire to leave something behind, is that kind of a legacy is so admirable, and I really appreciate it. The one scar on Lee's biography, I might add, is despite him trying gamely and courageously to avoid all connections with Ivy League institutions, he was a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, JFK School, a number of years ago. So, Lee, why don't you talk about your life and history, and then we'll turn to some questions.
And wonderful. Well, thank you, Mike, and it's so typical of you that you're so generous in your remarks. I appreciate them, and I appreciate being here at the D.C. office of Hoover. As you say, I did put my papers are at the Hoover archives because there are so many other conservatives and also anti-communists at the Hoover as well. So it's a rich, rich trove. And for those of you who are interested in writing about or learning more about communism and anti-communism, the place to go is the Hoover Institution, which was founded by Herbert Hoover in 1919, as a matter of fact. You should know that the president's essay written by Dr. Fulner at the Heritage Foundation is going to be on Mr. Hoover, Herbert Hoover. It'll be out another month or so. Oh, wow. So I've been helping doing some of the research and learning so much about Herbert Hoover, who was a most admirable man, but unfortunately was saddled with the idea that he was personally responsible somehow for the Great Depression. That's not the case. It really is not. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've tried to do with this book is to look back, particularly at some of the things I've written and some of the people whom I've known. And if you think about it, there really were giants, conservative giants, who walked the earth in the last half of the 19th century, the 20th century. Those giants were, in my opinion, Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and Bill Buckley. And as a matter of fact, I wrote biographies of all three of them, studied them, and so trying to sort of sum up, what do they have in common? Well, they were charismatic leaders who could inspire an audience to action. They believed that free enterprise could bring more prosperity to more people than any other economic system. They looked to a transcendent being for guidance and inspiration. They were believers. They were practicing men of faith. They hated communism, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write about them, and every other form of tyranny over the mind of man. And they used the Constitution as their North Star. It wasn't just something that they did on their own. Barry Goldwater. I think if I were to ask the audience, either here or watching and listening, who was Barry Goldwater, they might have sort of vague idea of who he was. But he was essential to the conservative movement and to what we call the conservative revolution. As a matter of fact, Barry Goldwater sparked the conservative revolution, but a most unlikely revolutionary. He was the grandson of a Jewish peddler who, born in Poland, his grandfather, made his way to San Francisco during the gold rush. That did not pan out so well. Then came next door into Arizona, made his way down and wound up in Phoenix, where he turned his little peddling operation into the leading department store in Phoenix. Goldwater was a college dropout. He did freshman year, and then that was it. What happened was that his father died early, unexpectedly, and he had to go back and help to run the business. Although he was a college dropout, he wrote a little book called The Conscience of a Conservative. 120-some pages. If you haven't read it, I'd counsel you to do so. It sold 3.5 million copies. Published in 1960, still worth a read, still holds up very, very well. 3.5 million copies. Oh, if only something that I had written would sell that many. Oh, I'd even settle maybe for 100,000. Let's see. Shirley, you're here. Come on. We got to get out there and really promote this book. Never smoked a cigarette because of his mother's injunction. Never had a cup of coffee, but he did keep a bottle of Old Crow in his Senate refrigerator for after 5 sipping. And he would bring over senators from the other aisle, from the other side of the aisle. So the Democrats and Republicans would sit down over a little Old Crow, a little bourbon and water, maybe not too much water, and talk over things and begin to form relationships and friendships. And how I wish that we could have more of that today. There are many what ifs in politics, but consider this. If there had been a President Goldwater, we can be sure of 2 things. The Vietnam War would have been won in 12 months, or else President Goldwater would have brought the troops home. He would have used whatever force was necessary, whether it was mining, whether it was bombing, or whatever it was. No nuclear weapons, no, because he made that clear during that campaign. But he would have said, we're either going to win this war in a set time or we're going to come home. And certainly there would have been no land war. He would have taken his lead from both General Eisenhower and General MacArthur, who said, as a matter of principle, America should not get involved in a land war in Asia. And Barry Goldwater took that counsel. The other thing that would have been different is there would have been no Great Society. And so that trillion-dollar experiment in welfarism would not have been attempted. I was the director of communications for the Goldwater for President Committee. But before that, I was also the news director for the draft Goldwater Committee. Now, I was hired late in the year. As a matter of fact, consider this. My first day of work was supposed to be full day of work. I'd been a volunteer assistant for months and months and months. November 25th, 1963. Now consider that date, November 25th. Well, November 22nd came first, the day that Kennedy was assassinated. I was the news director for the draft Goldwater Committee, and I ran back to the committee headquarters as soon as that announcement was made, and I was in the eye of a storm. You can imagine handling inquiries from the press, from the media, after Kennedy has been killed, because everybody's assumption was, almost everybody's, who killed him? Somebody on the right. And so for about 2 hours there was no knowledge of who did it, and therefore Dallas, it happened in Dallas, and one TV anchor said, well, this was the heart of Goldwater land. That's how he described Dallas. We had people banging on the doors, yelling at us, assassins, murderers. There was a bomb threat. We had to bring some police in and a dog. Didn't find any bombs, but we were under tremendous pressure for those 2 hours. And then came the announcement that it was someone who had been with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and we were so, in a sense, relieved because we knew this was a pro-Castro, pro-communist Cuba front. And so we could say that it was not one of ours, it was one of theirs who was responsible for the death. Barry Goldwater was a very, very blunt guy, spoke very directly. That's why we loved him as members of Young Americans for Freedom. And I can see a couple of young people out here with their YAF buttons, as a matter of fact. And I can remember the first time that I had my first formal meeting with Senator Goldwater as Director of Communications, and I'd put together this comprehensive campaign. I was going to be talking about how he had flown food and supplies to snowbound Navajos, who otherwise, who knows, might have perished. How he had been a member of both the Urban League and the NAACP in Phoenix. He had been pro-civil rights. I was talking about how he'd gone down the Columbia River in a wooden boat, you know, dangerous. How he'd flown over the Himalayas during World War II, when that too was dangerous. I was about 2 minutes into my presentation when all of a sudden this big hand comes out from the center. He says, Lee, stop. If you try any of that Madison Avenue crap in my campaign, I will throw you out of this office and out of the campaign. Is that clear? Well, he was a 2-star general. I was a corporal. And I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. He said, this will be a campaign of principles, not of personalities. Marvelous, but wrong. Wrong. Because if we had been able to talk more about the human side and the non-political side of Barry Goldwater, it's possible that people would have said, well, he doesn't sound or look like a warmonger or somebody who's going to destroy Social Security. But that was just the way Barry Goldwater was. He was going to offer a conservative choice and not a liberal echo in that campaign. The other thing we should talk about in that campaign was what happened in the last week to a particular TV program called A Time for Choosing. A number of California Republicans had decided to buy time on a TV network and to present A Time for Choosing by Ronald Reagan, praising Barry Goldwater. The day before it was to be telecast, Goldwater calls Reagan, and I happened to be there when this is going on. And he says, Ronnie, my staff here is not too happy about this TV talk of yours. It's, among other things, talks about Social Security, and we sort of put that to a side, and we really would like to run something else. We'd like to rerun this half hour we have of me with Ike at Gettysburg. And Ronnie says, well, you know, gee, everybody seems to like the TV address, and I've been giving it, and people like it, and I can't help you. You got to talk to the people who put up the money for it. And then he said, well, Barry, have you heard it? I said, well, no, actually, I have not. Let me call it, listen to it, and I'll call back. So they ran an audio version of A Time for Choosing. And Goldwater says, well, what the hell's wrong with that? Run it. So he calls back Reagan. He says, go with it. Go with it. That TV program, that one program, made Ronald Reagan a political star, national political star, overnight. It raised easily $1 million within 24 hours, changed thousands of votes, and it led to a bunch of Republicans coming to Reagan and saying, we want you to run for governor the following year. That's how important that was. In political shorthand, one can say, no candidate Goldwater, I think no President Reagan. That's how important that speech was. Extraordinary. Ronald Reagan, my first meeting with him, serious meeting, was in October of 1965. And he had been spending the last several months testing the waters, as he called it, to see if the people of California wanted him to run. He'd pretty much made up his mind. But I called him up and I said that, and I was working on a profile of him for Reader's Digest. And I said, can I come out and visit with him? He said, oh yes, come on ahead. So for 2 days, myself and my wife, Ann, traveled with him. Now, she had been active in New York politics, and I valued her judgment, and she'd also has been an editor and a fellow co-author with me. And so there were 4 of us, only 4 of us in this limo. There was the driver, Ann up in the front seat next to him, me in the back, and Reagan over here. And between me and Reagan was my tape recorder. Now, I won't bother to get out an iPhone. You guys all know what an iPhone is. I had a woolen sock, which is this big. It's like a piece of luggage. It's an old reel-to-reel. And I had that between us. And with a great big microphone, which I was asking Reagan questions. I asked about his political philosophy, and I thought I'd share with you on this. This is 1965. He quoted a 1947 interview in which he said that whether, quote, it comes from management or labor or government or the right, the left, or the center, whatever imposes on the freedom of the individual is tyranny and must be opposed. That was his philosophy, which he had come to over years of study and reflection and reading. Well, at the end of that second day, of course, we were convinced, Ann and I both, that, you know, as we said, he's got it. I mean, he's really got it. And he said, well, come on up to the house, have some iced tea. We've been working hard, give you some cookies. So we went up Pacific Palisades to their home. Very modest home, actually, not a great big sprawling mansion, filled with all kinds of GE gimmicks because he'd been working for GE for all those years. And he went into the kitchen with Nancy to do the iced tea and cookies, put us in the library den, which was very small, really. And I looked over. Here were all of these shelves and shelves of books. So, of course, what did I do? Right? Got up, began looking at them, looking at the titles. History, politics, economics, volume after volume after volume. And I began looking at the titles. Conservative classics, and there are 4 books in particular that I'll mention. The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, a Nobel laureate. Witness by Whittaker Chambers, an extraordinary autobiography of an ex-Soviet spy. Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, a classic of its time. And a book which I had not read, The Law by Frederick Bastiat. I said, well, who is Frederick Bastiat? I learned later, a 19th century economist, a free enterpriser, and someone who had influenced many, many people, including Ronald Reagan. Okay, well, I said, okay, but maybe he hadn't read them. So I reached out and began taking the books out of the shelves, and Anne said, no, stop, don't do that. You know, Nancy may, no, it's going to be okay. As I picked them out, opened it up, dog-eared, underlined, little phrases in the margins. He had read these. No, I'm not saying that he read every book that closely, but those classics that I'm talking about, yes, he had. And here was a thinking, reasoning person who had arrived at his philosophy the old-fashioned way, one book at a time. And I said right then and there that Reagan is an intellectual. He's an intellectual. He's comfortable with ideas. He understands the power of ideas. And with that kind of foundation, that kind of intellectual foundation, a political leader can do all kinds of marvelous things, which, as we know, is exactly what he did. In my last book, I wrote 4 books about Reagan. I talked about various qualities that he had, his courage, and also his sense of humor. And I'd like to share with you, here was a bit of humor at a summit meeting that he did with Gorbachev. It's a story of the American and the Russian arguing about the freedom in their countries. And the American said, now look, I can go into the Oval Office, pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running this country. The Russian said, well, I can do that too. You can, the American said. And the Russian said, sure, I can go into the Kremlin, look into the General Secretary and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way that President Reagan is running his country. Now, yeah, it's a great story and funny as all get out, but then you begin to find, there's a moral here, there's a lesson here, there's something that Reagan was trying to communicate to Gorbachev, which is about freedom of expression and how we must break down those barriers, if possible, between us. He had, as you know, the rare ability to see what others could not. And this is what we call the quality of wisdom. You think about it, this is the early 1980s. You had liberal intellectuals like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and John Kenneth Galbraith, who were visiting Moscow, coming back after being over there for weeks and weeks, and lauding the economic accomplishments of the Soviet Union in the early 80s. They were lauding it. We now know that the Soviet Union was an economic basket case. When Gorbachev came in 85, just a couple of years later, he was horrified at the shape of the economy because they've been spending so much money on arms in an arms race. So what was Ronald Reagan saying at the same time that people like Schlesinger and Galbraith were saying? He was telling the British Parliament that Marxism-Leninism was headed for the ash heap of history. Now you go back, you'll find that people were sort of poo-pooing that, but he was absolutely right. And of course, before the end of that decade, and by the end of that decade, the Berlin Wall was down, and the Soviet Union in 1991 was no more. That sense of humor. In December of 1981, and I'd rewritten my Reagan bio again, and I wanted to present a copy of it to him. And my publisher said, well, look, be sure and have a chapter in there about the attempted assassination, which I did, so I added that to this edition. And then he said, well, we're going to do something special on the cover. So in black, big black letters on a yellow background, complete through the assassination attempt. I said, it's very tacky, you know. I don't like that. I don't like that. But this will be great for sales. Complete through the assassination attempt. I went back and forth and found out, okay. So come into the Oval Office, and there is Reagan. He had been almost died in March. This was December. He looked fabulous, looked like about 50, big smile, been building up his body. He looked strong, vital. He just made you feel so good. And I said, Mr. President, here's a copy of the biography. Oh, thank you. And so it's a photo op, and they're taking pictures, and we're chatting back and forth. And he looks down. I can see him at the cover, complete through the assassination attempt. And he raises his head. He says, well, Lee, I'm sorry I messed up your ending. You know, who but Reagan could make a joke out of somebody trying to kill him? Amazing. Bill Buckley rescued me from myself. Now, I'd been over in Paris at the Sorbonne, occasionally going to class, but spending a lot of time doing research at various cafes and you know, testing the alcoholic content of various drinks. But I also was writing, and I thought that I was going to be the next Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway. And I kept getting back rejection slips. I wrote a novel, rejected, wrote short stories, wrote poems, rejected. And I got very depressed and saying, well, you know, what am I doing? I came back home, sitting in my parents' home, thinking, well, what am I going to do? Should I write another novel? More short stories, whatever. And I took time out to write an essay, short, about France, where I'd been living, saying that unless they elected a strong leader like a de Gaulle, they were headed for, you know, the bottom, a long ways from Napoleon. And I sent this off to National Review, and I had never met Bill Buckley, and he accepted it and published it. And I said, oh, the market is telling me something. The market is telling me something.
Was that your first publication?
Yeah, that was my first publication. First professional publication was in National Review. And so I put aside the novels and the short stories and the poems and began writing nonfiction, and thank heavens that I did. As I mentioned, and I'll finish up, let me say one more thing about Bill Buckley, because I think this is important. We may get a question about this. I think an important lesson to be taken from Bill Buckley's career and life is this. We need to practice fusionism. When Buckley started National Review, deliberately included on the masthead conservatives, libertarians, and anti-communists. Those are the three major strains of conservatism at the time. Then welcomed people like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich and others of the New Right and the social conservatives, and then also welcomed Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, and the neocons, putting together this broad coalition. That, I submit to you, is what we need today, is a new fusionism, a new fusionism. Now, not easy, because there are many more strains of conservatism today, not just 4 or 5, maybe 8 or 9 or 10. I haven't read the Post this morning, so maybe there's one new one. But we need that new fusionism. As I say, they all were anti-communists. And that's how I got into conservatism, was through anti-communism. Living in Paris, I was there in October of 1956 when the Hungarian Revolution occurred. I was so exhilarated, I was so excited, because all of these young men and women my age were standing up against the Soviets. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, the Soviet tanks came back, the troops came back, they killed thousands of young people my age. Thousands and tens of thousands of Hungarians fled. And I kept waiting for my government to do something, and they didn't. It was some perfunctory matter-of-fact statement, but I was looking for action. And I resolved at that point that whatever I could do for the rest of my life to support those who were opposing communism and opposing tyranny, I would do whatever I could to help them. And coming out of that was the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And we founded and we dedicated that memorial in June of 2007, a decade ago, 10 years ago. We're very fortunate in that President Bush was there to accept it for the American people. Wasn't easy. It took us 14 years. Mm-hmm. And there are 24 steps which you must negotiate to build a monument in Washington, D.C. 24. And we went through all of them. Mm-hmm. And since that time, since that dedication a decade ago, dozens of national leaders have visited the Victims of Communism Memorial to lay a wreath and to say a prayer. And this past June, some 22 embassies laid wreaths at our annual commemoration ceremony. And then we were joined by more than 20 ethnic groups as well, particularly those from China, Korea, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam as well. We're going to continue to disseminate the truth about communism, particularly about those 5 regimes, those 5 communist regimes, China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Laos. And as Mike said, a week from today, we're going to have an anniversary, not a celebration, but a marking of the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the God that failed, and we invite you all to it. We look forward to that day when all the remaining captive peoples and nations are free and independent. We're sure that that day will come because we know that the truth will make you and keep you free. That's what we're all about. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lee. Let me start off, ask one question about at the personal side. I didn't realize that the PhD you have was something you pursued and acquired later in life, that you had been living a full life as an activist involved in different aspects, like you say, of the conservative movement, but then you decided to get a PhD. It was in history, I assume.
Politics.
Oh, politics, okay. That's a big decision. Maybe give us a little background on that, but also, and once you got into the thick of that, was there anything, any intellectual tradition, any writers and thinkers that you had not at that point become aware of that because of your studies, you suddenly became acquainted with, and the intellectual journey aspect of this? Right.
Well, it was a political journey first because I'd had my own public affairs firm here in Washington, only working with conservative and anti-communist clients and candidates, and I'd done the presidential campaign, and Bob Dole was a client of mine, Strom Thurmond was a client of mine, and a number of congressmen, the Republican National Committee, the White House even. So that was all great fun. But I was burned out, frankly, after 20 years. And I said, no mas. I mean, no more. That's enough. That's enough. And I said, I've always wanted to teach. And I've been writing all the way along, despite also ghosting for others. And I said, if I want to teach, though, I must have a PhD. I must have that. And I gave a lecture at Catholic University on the 1980 election. And I predicted that Reagan would win. And someone from the politics department said, why don't you come over and get a PhD here at Catholic University? So with that encouragement, I did. Another reason why I did it was that our bookkeeper embezzled us, stole from us several thousands and thousands of dollars. And people said, well, you really ought to declare bankruptcy. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pay off everything that we owe. It was considerable. But that also persuaded me that perhaps the time was to close down the doors of Lee Edwards and Associates, which is what I did. Intellectually, I now had an opportunity to read in such depth that I hadn't before. I mean, for the first time, I really read seriously The Conservative Mind, The Road to Serfdom, The Constitution of Liberty, and other classic conservative texts. And then a whole array of books about foreign policy, international relations, and so forth. And I just loved it. And I began from that thinking, well, what kind of classes can I put together? I got that degree in '86 and began teaching at Catholic University in '87, and I just completed my 30th year of teaching at Catholic University as an adjunct. And I'm going to be doing the politics of the '80s.
Oh, really?
In the spring, yeah. I have been doing the politics of the '60s, but I'm going to try the '80s in the spring.
Wow, that's wonderful. I just think I admire that you were able to make that transition.
Well, it would not have been possible, Mike, except for my wife, Ann, who let me do it, and our daughters. Yeah. Because, you know, I was doing things in the evenings and on the weekends and so forth. And they backed me up, particularly Ann, God bless her. Things got a little tight there, shall we say. A lot of hamburger helper. And
it was pre-Chick-fil-A, though, wasn't it? Okay, at this point, how about we turn to our audience for some questions? And please, you have a microphone in the back. Christine Brooks.
Thank you, Mike. Lee, one of the stories that I've heard you tell a couple of times that I always enjoy hearing you tell is stories about going to political conventions with your father when you were, I think, 11 years old?
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear what you think about political conventions now as opposed to the ones you remember attending as a child. I'm sure they've changed significantly.
Right, right. Well, political conventions, I went to the first one in 1948 when I was, 15, 14, something like that, in Philadelphia. And my father was with a reporter of the Chicago Tribune, a political reporter. He covered White House, Washington, D.C. from the 1930s to the 1970s. And covered every president from FDR to Nixon. Covered every political convention from 1940 to 1972. And so he brought me along in 1948. And what I remember, of course, I was not still quite young, just how noisy it was, how smoke-filled it was. I remember the smoke, this convention hall in Philadelphia, you know, oh, you get high just on inhaling, and the lights. I mean, there was always something going on. It was bright, it was vibrant, it was something vital going on. You could feel all of that. My own personal first convention, 1960, when Walter Judd almost stampeded the convention with his keynote address and almost forced Richard Nixon to take him as his running mate. If he had, Nixon might very well have won. Conventions are important because platforms are important. That's still my argument. They inspire, they inform, they lay down a foundation for the workers of the party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. So platforms are important, and they are formed at a convention. Now, you don't have the smoke-filled room like I saw or smelled in 1948 that you did then, because today we have the primary system. And so much of what is determined at a convention has already been determined by who has won this or that primary. Frankly, I wish there were more of a balance. I think the wisdom, to bring in the wisdom, the collective wisdom of political leaders is important. And I wish, I don't want half a dozen people to sit around and make the choice, but I think there should be more input from them. And I think this idea that it only depends upon what primaries determine, I think that's going a little too far.
Thanks, Mike. And Lee, thank you so much for your body of work and all you've done in the pursuit of liberty. We can't thank you enough for all you've done.
Thank you.
Just wanted to talk a little bit more about fusionism and the fact that you hadn't read the post today. Well, there's a new group that's formed that includes Bill Kristol, our friend Mona Charon, Evan McMullen, they've sent a letter up to the Hill saying, you know, support the Mueller investigation. How do we come back together as a conservative movement when there's so many different factions now? We've got the people who want to kick out everybody in Congress. We have the people who want to support Trump no matter what. It seems to be more divided than ever. And how do you see that coming back together?
Well, fusionism was easy 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when Bill Buckley first conceived the idea with the help of Frank Meyer, because there were only 3 strains. Then along came the neoconservatives, and then the social conservatives, the new right. This gave you 5. Today you probably have maybe 10, and who knows, Bill Kristol may do one more new one tomorrow, depending upon what the reaction is to one he tried to launch today. But I think that's all to the good. I don't mean to make fun of that, because to my mind, although the movement has many more elements, many more strains, no question about that, all of that to me is an indication of vitality. You know, people want to be in a position to lead and to direct this movement in this direction or that direction. I mean, they're fighting over the control of something very important, not something unimportant or something that's ready to be interred. Quite the contrary. What was vital, it seems to me, in the first case with the original fusionism, number one, there was charismatic, principled leadership in Bill Buckley intellectually and Ronald Reagan politically. And then there was a dual threat, an external threat, which was the Soviet Union, and an internal threat, which was liberalism, as reflected in the Great Society. What we need today for our new fusionism, and I've written about this, and I think it's going to be in National Affairs, perhaps in a next issue or two. Yuval likes it, thinks it makes sense. And this new fusionism is to focus on 1 or 2 demonstrable, visible threats. And I think that we were reminded once again that the external threat today is radical jihadism, as what happened in Manhattan just a couple of days ago. The Heritage Foundation did a study, was published just in the last week or two. There have been 98 terrorist attacks since 9/11, 98, which have been prevented by our measures coming out of the Patriot Act. Increased intelligence, more visible presence of police, the FBI getting involved, and so forth. So that's the external threat. The internal threat is, well, I take Bernie Sanders' appeal very seriously, particularly among young people. Young people think, oh, well, socialism is just one more political philosophy. It's far more than that, far more than that. It is a direct threat to our way of life, to our system of looking at economics. I was asked this question, well, what do we do about it? And I said, well, the next time a young person says, I don't see anything wrong with being a socialist, to say, well, would you like to give up any right to have anything personal that you own? Just, you know, you no longer can have anything personal that you can call your own. Are you willing to believe that the individual is not important, that only the group is important? Are you willing to give up all of your individual rights to the group, to the country? And finally, are you willing to give up God? Are you willing to give up any belief in a transcendent being? Because those are the things that socialism/communism are all about. They're against private property. They're against the individual. They're for groupthink. And they're against God, the opiate of the people, of the masses. So those are the 2 threats. And the other thing that we need is that charismatic principled leadership. That's not exactly obvious right now. But I think that person or persons will come to light because I don't think that we can just sit back and expect the conservative movement to do nothing. I think quite the contrary. It's being challenged right now to come together, to fuse itself, to begin to do what it has done in the past. And I think that day is sooner perhaps than a lot of people realize.
Nicholas Romero, I'm a former Yaffer myself, so it's a pleasure to meet somebody who...
I thought you were once a Yaffer, always a Yaffer.
Sure. Well, I think you become an Ofer at some point.
That's it.
An old American for freedom.
Right.
So, yeah, but I was a Yaffer in undergraduate school in California, and it's an honor to meet somebody who signed the Sharon Statement. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the events that led up to that famous document in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. Well, the picture is it's 1960. And if you're a young conservative in 1960, what are your alternatives? I mean, you've got John Kennedy, who's obviously, for the day, a liberal Democrat, and you've got, for the Republicans, a moderate, sometimes conservative, anti-communist, but it's really basically a moderate in Richard Nixon. So where do you go? What if you truly believe in limited government? What if you truly believe in free enterprise? What if you truly believe in individual freedom and responsibility? What if you truly believe in a strong national defense? All these compromises which are going on within this party and that party, what you need is an organization committed to conservatism, not young Republicans, but young conservatives. So Bill Buckley said, that makes sense to me. I will be happy to host a meeting. So about 90 of us showed up at Sharon, his home, in September of 1960 to found Young Americans for Freedom. And you might be interested in, there were two arguments, two big basic arguments. Number one was whether or not the phrase God-given rights should be in it, whether the word God-given or phrase God-given should be in the Sharon Statement. Mm-hmm. And we debated that. And there was a vote taken on it. And the vote was 44 to 40 to keep that vote. I mean, there were libertarians at the beginning. They were there as part of that coalition that we're putting together. That's how close it was. Now, what did the libertarians do? Did they walk out? No. They stuck around. They said, well, this new organization is going. We're going to sit around. We're going to debate. We're going to see where it goes and so forth. We're going to make a commitment. So they stuck to it. They didn't walk out. The other debate was over the name. The two possible names were Young Conservatives of America or Young Americans for Freedom. And I and David Frank and others were for Young Americans for Freedom. We wanted to be inclusive. We wanted to reach out to as many different people as possible. And we thought that maybe just calling ourselves conservative was too limited. So that vote was much more dominant for Young Americans for Freedom. And we thought at that time, as I said to you earlier, well, we were quite full of ourselves, pretty arrogant, that we could change the world. Mm-hmm. And we didn't change the world, perhaps, but we made a difference in American politics and maybe had some impact upon the world itself.
I have a three-part question.
Uh-oh. Keep track.
My name's Heather Gradison. Are you the one who came up with the bumper sticker AUH2O?
No. No, let's get that out of the way. No, that came out early by somebody who had a scientific background, obviously, Goldwater, AUH2O. But people loved it because it was so different in American politics, and there were bumper stickers and placards and things there and so forth like that. Wish I could claim.
Well, I was 8 years old, and that was the beginning of my learning the periodic table. The word conservative has taken on just a terrible distinction. The liberal media has made it come across that way. And yet we now have this new word for liberal called progressive. Any idea of how that happened?
Well, liberals have always called themselves progressives going back to Woodrow Wilson. This is nothing new about this. It's just that they liked and adopted with, I think it was FDR, liked the word liberal more so than progressive, but you want to go back to the origins. They were very pleased to call themselves progressive. I have to respectfully disagree with you. We've worked hard for 50, 60 years to make the word conservative acceptable. I think it is, and I think we should not give it up at all. It's a very honorable word. You can play around with it and talk about conserving things like the founding principles of our country, Western civilization, all kinds of things. So I think it's a good word. And
I live in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well, you got to get out of Washington.
Okay, and my final question, I hope it's not embarrassing.
Uh-oh.
Why haven't I ever heard of you?
Mike, I'll let you answer that.
That's one of those unanswerable questions. Well, yeah, but he's also, I think, in my exposure in Washington and conservative circles, Lee's been a major player. And you're right, a lot of it is behind the scenes. He's very modest. He's not one of those sharp-elbowed types that walk into a room and wants everyone to know he's in there. He has accomplished what he's accomplished through with grace and style, modesty, you know, and his intellect. So.
Clearly, in the Senate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's why he has a great biography.
I used to put him on TV as often as possible.
Yeah, you have to get out more. I think that's the message here.
Well, I'm waiting for my invitation from Cato, Christine, to come on. You got to talk to your bosses.
Hi, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. My question has nothing to do with what you were talking about today. Pardon me for that, but I can't help. President Trump is leaving to Asia Pacific presidential trip, which is very, very important. If you have any opinion on that, it's kind of vague, but I would appreciate it.
Right. Well, I'll say this. I have visited Asia quite a few times over the years. I had a particular interest in that because of a man named Walter Judd, who was a very important advisor on U.S.-Asian relations, and particularly China, for many, many years to a number of presidents from Truman to Reagan, as a matter of fact. I think it's a very important trip. We can see what President Xi is doing over there in China. He's being very aggressive. He is challenging us, and I think we have to be prepared to answer, firmly, and not belligerently. But, for example, this idea of the islands out there in the South China Sea, and that cannot be permitted. The idea that we might be weakening our support of Taiwan, that cannot be allowed. Taiwan and the Republic of China is an important actor out there in that part of the world. If it's necessary, we need to encourage Japan to develop the appropriate weapons to counter North Korea. I see where the president of South Korea said yesterday, today, whatever, that he is against developing nuclear weapons for South Korea. Well, I think he needs to rethink that, and I think there needs to be an open debate about that in Korea, and perhaps we can help end that debate. So I think this is a very important trip. And yes, we have to be concerned about Europe, but we are an Asian power still. And so what happens out there can have an influence, not only for today, but tomorrow as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. My name is Maurizio Geri. I'm from Italy, but I just finished my PhD here in Virginia. So my question is, what these great conservative of the past that you mentioned, Reagan, Goldwater, and the other, would say of today problems of democracies? We have a big erosion of democratic values around the world in democracies. I come from Europe. I could speak about Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and many others. With Mike, we were in a conference in Colorado on World Affairs, and we spoke about the return of nationalism and the return of populism as a threat to democratic liberal values in the Western world. So more than communist regimes like in the last century born through coup, d'etat or through revolutions. Today we have a big erosion. And many scholars talk about authoritarianization of democracies. So what the great, if you could imagine the great conservative of the past, what they could say about this and what we should do to fight against this. Thank you very much.
I think we have to be very careful about overreacting to the certain actions which have taken place in places like Hungary and Poland. And I've talked to young people in those two countries, and they're comfortable with a nationalism as they define it because they are still democracies. With much criticism, for example, of Hungary, but at the same time, the people of Hungary have given a 2/3 majority in the parliament to the present party, majority party there. The same thing in Poland, not quite the same margin in the parliament, but still considerable. So I think we have to be very careful about just dismissing, quote, nationalism. Nationalism within a democratic context, it seems to me, is permissible. It's allowable. It's what the people want at this particular time. I think here at home, the same thing. I think we have to be very careful. It's so easy to be distracted by Mr. Trump, isn't it? I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in what I call the Twitter game. I think we should, with regard to Mr. Trump and the president, follow two tracks. One track, the more important track, is to look at what he's doing. And as a conservative, I like very much the Gorsuch nomination. I like very much his standing up against ISIS, as we see how important that is, given what happened in Manhattan just a couple of days ago. I like very much his deregulation campaign, what he's carrying out there. I like very much his tax cuts as a conservative. Those are all good things. Now, some of the other things on trade and so forth, immigration, that's not something. But on the other hand, the other track is the Twitter track. And yes, you cannot ignore it, but you can't allow it to subsume whatever is happening in the other track. So let's focus on the more important parts of this administration, what is being done and accomplished, and maybe a little less on the rhetoric. And maybe just sit back a little bit and try to enjoy it. That it's a part of it's some sort of game. It's some sort of thing that he's doing to maybe to make us smile at the outrageousness of it.
But there have been some scholars who they're writing about a democracy recession, around the world, and Turkey is an example, and I think maybe the Philippines and so on. Is there a role for? I mean, one thing I remember about Heritage, one of the few federal programs that Heritage usually supported and wanted usually to resist any attempts to cut and in many cases grow, were the public diplomacy elements of our State Department and other agencies that, the Radio Free Europe and those kinds of things. Is there a role to, is there any kind of a soft power public diplomacy kind of role to help citizens in those countries not see those countries fall under the sway of a authoritarian type, a return to authoritarianism?
Right. Well, certainly, if you look back, you're talking about previous leaders. If I were to ask Goldwater or Reagan or Walter Judd what they would say today, they would not be for an America first. They would say that isolationism is not possible. They would say that freedom, the cause of freedom, concerns us, and we should encourage it. We should promote it. We should publicize it wherever we can and however we can. And that has to be not only through specific programs like you're talking about, Mike, but also has to be done by our leader. And this is why I certainly fault the president for this. But yet at the same time, we can see he's reaching out. He's going to Asia, right? He's spending 10 days there. He's had meetings with Mr. Abe. He's had meetings with other leaders of other countries. So he's not ignoring the world. And so I think there must be a balance there in which we say, okay, let's be concerned about what affects us first, but we have to acknowledge at the same time that what affects us is also the state of freedom around the world. And let's speak up. Let's speak up when we see dangers to that freedom, whether it's in Europe, or whether it's Asia, whether it's Africa, whether it's Latin America. It's a heavy burden, but we still are the one sole superpower in the world.
Right.
And that carries with it very, very solemn responsibilities, which we cannot ignore.
Thank you. Thank you for your book and your career. Back to Buckley. His only child, Chris Buckley, wrote what many see as a devastating book about his parents. What was your reaction to it?
Well, I wish that Chris had not written that book. I think it was added little to the life and career, really, and the impact of Bill Buckley. Obviously, though, he had to write it. It was something that he had to get off his chest and out of his mind, out of his spirit. And so he did. But what I can say is, although that was a devastating portrait, that in the last year of Bill Buckley's life, Chris Buckley and Bill Buckley, father and son, were reconciled. Chris moved into the home up there in Stamford, and that last year he was with his father night and day, and was there the day that he died. And I think that says perhaps more about Chris than the book that he wrote about his mother and father.
Okay, I think maybe with that, please join me in a warm round of applause for Lee Edwards. Thank you.